We're joined today by House Majority Leader Representative Matt Bradford. As we conduct this interview in late July, the state budget is not yet completely resolved. Can you explain why we're in the current situation we're in?
I think the most succinct reason is obviously the Senate sent over a budget it authored. The House passed it after the Senate had done so. At this point, the last step is for the Senate to sign that budget and send it over to the governor for his signature. That typically is just a ministerial move. At this point, that has not happened for reasons that frankly belie reason, but the Senate needs to send it expeditiously to the governor so that we have the general appropriations bill in place.
For those that have not been following along over the last month or so, what are the major areas of disagreement?
Well, I think the general appropriations bill, which is the main budget document, is largely in agreement. The Senate voted for it. The House voted for it in a bipartisan manner. I think really the last thing is for it to go to the governor for his signature. Beyond that, we can have a discussion about code bills, which often are passed at the same time as the budget. Because of the unique way where the Senate sent over a general appropriations bill without an accompanying code bill. There's a discussion that can be had and we're open to having, but obviously the first step is to get that GA bill in place.
Senate Republican Majority Leader Joe Pittman said that the Senate Republican caucus and the governor had an agreement that included the PASS program, which is essentially a school voucher program. Was your caucus at all involved at any time in any kind of negotiation that involved this program?
Absolutely. Senator Pittman raised many times his desire to see, as part of a budget, a private school voucher program. I stated very clearly that did not have sufficient support in our caucus. We discussed, and the governor, to his credit, made very clear that the House Democrats were not on board. I made very clear that the House Democrats were on board. The Senate decided unilaterally to send that bill over without support in the House. The governor, in order to get a budget in place so we didn't have an impasse, agreed to blue line the offending provision to allow us to get a GA bill in place. And frankly, I think that is the crux of why the Senate is holding out in terms of just literally delivering the budget bill to the governor for his signature.
And a moment ago, you referred to the code bills. For those that are not familiar, can you just explain the function they serve and where they are in the process as well?
Yeah, I think the general appropriations bill is basically, it's exactly that. It appropriates dollars. It says to the governor, there's $45 billion, give or take. Here's how we want to fund government. The code bills often go along with that as kind of what I'll say an instruction manual or a limiting document that will limit the governor's ability to otherwise spend that dollars. And sometimes it's everything from this is the formula to drive out these funds. Often, frankly, that is typically the case. They're not a necessity, but they would be helpful in terms of driving certain dollars where the legislature may want to see them go. Again, for reasons that I will never quite fully understand, they sent the GA without the fiscal code or any of the code bills. Again, not a necessity. I think the most important thing is to make sure that our counties and our human service providers, our school districts have that money. And once that budget is signed by the governor, that will happen. And I think that is the most important thing, that we live up to our constitutional obligation to pass a budget.
Now that we're past June 30th without a completely finalized budget, what state-funded programs will be the first to be impacted by the lack of continued funding?
Yeah, it's to be determined, but typically when these things have happened, typically you have a budget impasse because you have, one chamber or both chambers not passing a budget. This is not that case. Both chambers have passed the budget. So the real question becomes what areas of human services, county services, and school districts will run into the most problems. It's probably, simply put, the ones that have the least fund balances on hand, the one that are expected to provide services. I know there was a letter that went out from Education Secretary Mameen the other day, letting school districts to know that they're not going to get certain special ed fundings as soon as the end of this month. There will not be money available for payroll starting in next month. Some school districts will be able to weather that better than others, but all school districts are going to have to also deal with the reality that there may be a challenge in terms of having to take out loans and the borrowing costs. So we're going to needlessly accrue a lot of pain to a lot of collateral damage and frankly, folks that had nothing to do with this whole challenge.
Since you refer to education specifically, 15% of special education is due at the end of July, 15% of basic education due in August. What's the likelihood that the legislature takes some sort of action before these areas are affected?
I would hope the Senate would send it over forthwith. Again, this has never been an issue before. This is quite frankly, an alarming precedent where the Senate is not going to move a bill that has been passed by both chambers. I'm hoping they do that tomorrow. Frankly, we could have done it 3 weeks ago. But for whatever reason, let's get beyond that and let's get back to make sure we're funding our most basic government services.
Earlier this year, the Commonwealth Court ruled that Pennsylvania wasn't adequately funding education. Keeping that in mind, would the inclusion of Lifeline scholarships impact how much funding would have been allocated to public schools?
Well, no one has a crystal ball of how it would play out, but here's what I will tell you. The Commonwealth Court case is really it should be a lightning strike for those of us in the legislature who, frankly, many of us have talked about the inequity and the inadequacy of funding, and especially how it protects certain school districts. One of the things I'm so glad to hear is those who are pushing for Lifeline is their deep concern about our most impoverished schools and our schools that have been most shortchanged, especially those communities, often Black and brown communities, that have not received their fair share of funding and support for those children. These dollars that have not gone to those districts because of our unconstitutional, again, that's not me saying it, that's our Commonwealth Court saying that. These school districts that have been most adversely affected, frankly, for generations, are finally going to see a light at the end of the tunnel. We have an obligation to get constitutionally adequate, equitable funding for our public schools passed forthwith. Obviously, I've always said we are nothing if not willing to have a discussion about alternatives, but those alternatives need to be as part of a larger discussion about our constitutional obligation to fund public education.
Many of the poorest performing schools are based in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, particularly inner cities, which are largely represented by members of your caucus. Is it a tough sell for those members to vote against an option such as vouchers?
Well, I think it's a problem when it's faced as either or. The simple reality is there are communities that have been overtaxed, have school districts that have been under-resourced generationally, often in a way that, frankly, through the prism of equity and through the prism of Black and brown communities, these school districts have seen their tax base destroyed because of an educational system that is often viewed, rightfully or wrongly, as inferior. Taxes that are too high to make up for the lack of funding. There is so many parts of this. And now you have these schools in many cases, the actual brick and mortar buildings that have delayed maintenance for decades. We need to talk about a comprehensive way, not only to deal with the children of today that are in those schools, and I'm, again, very glad to have this conversation to make sure that they are provided the right level of education, but deal with the communities that have been devastated by an inequitable and unconstitutional funding system for decades.
Representative Sarah Innamorato announced her resignation earlier this month, bringing the House caucus balance to 101 square even. House Republican Appropriations Committee Chair Representative Seth Grove had this to say, quote, "Given the resignation of Representative Innamorato yesterday and scheduled special election for that seat on September 19th, I don't expect Democrats to engage with us in a meaningful way before September 26th when we return to session." What do you think of his comments?
I like and respect Seth very much, but I don't think anything could be further from the truth. We have an obligation to govern, whether Democrats are in control, Republicans are in control, or we find ourselves at 101. We have a constitutional obligation to get this budget finished. Let's get that done forthwith, and let's continue to have the conversation about how we can do the people's business. So I don't think we should use some artificial or some political barrier keep us in the way of doing the people's business that, frankly, we're being paid to do, regardless of the makeup of the legislature.
Looking ahead, what remains to be the top priorities for your caucus in this budget?
I think one of the things that was heartbreaking in the budget that was sent over to the Senate unilaterally was mental health. Last year frankly, right after one of the many heartbreaking mass shootings we had, there was a real bipartisan consensus that we needed to deal with adult mental health and the challenges. We may not have been able to come to a consensus on gun safety, but at that time, the Republican majority made a real statement, and I think Democrats were happy to join with them about sending $100 million specifically to deal with adult mental health challenges. This budget obviously redirects some of that money, a good chunk of that money, away from that purpose. I think we shouldn't pit whether it's schools against mental health. Listen, we have tens of billions of dollars right now in reserve. We also have a real mental health crisis among our children and among adults. And I think we need to address that. I think House Democrats and frankly, your point about Representative Grove, House Democrats and House Republicans worked together to pass with, I think, 170 votes, $100 million package for mental health. I think we should make sure that that's a priority in whatever comes out of the final days of these budget discussions.
Have the caucuses been communicating with one another since the June 30th budget deadline has passed?
Yeah, both at the leader level as well as staff level. So we continue to have those conversations. And obviously, we find ourselves in an awkward spot where the Senate's not sending over the bill. But I think once that's done, I think there's a recognition, again, regardless of the partisan makeup, that we have an obligation to govern and provide for our constituents.
You just mentioned the issue of mental health funding. Have you and other caucus leaders found other areas of mutual agreement that you think you can use to move forward?
I think there's always opportunities to talk on a myriad of discussions. One of the ideas out there is, frankly, education, which is a big part of what the budget dispute is. But I got to tell you something. I say this truly, and I hope it doesn't sound naive. Whether you support Lifeline or you recognize that we have $1 billion of obligation as a result of the Commonwealth Court, I think there's a unique moment in time here where everyone is interested in making sure we're dealing with our most impoverished school districts and making sure they have the accountability and the results and the resources that we expect for every child. So I want to make sure that we spend the next month, maybe it's the next year until the next budget, but let's use this moment in time to talk about accountability and transparency and how we can make sure, whether it's public or private options, that we make sure all those options are serving all of our kids, especially with that lens of our poorest kids.
What happens next? Who needs to take the next step to reconvene negotiations?
I don't think it's reconvene negotiations. I think it's obviously the Senate needs to come back, even if it's for non-voting, to sign the GA bill. Once that happens, communities, counties, human services providers, and school districts will get the funding that we already talked back flowing. That will create some progress and hopefully allow some normalcy to retake this conversation so we can have those conversations about things like education, about mental health, about potentially passing code bills. I think there's much more to do. I think, you had mentioned before areas where we can work together. I think on tax policy, House Democrats were proud last year to come forward and talk about C&I reduction. We would love to have a conversation about C&I acceleration, match that up with NOL and other pro-growth tax policies. Traditionally, these are not policies you heard spoken by Democrats. This is a different Democratic majority that wants to talk about how we grow this economy. We're going to continue to have long-term challenges, especially in Western Pennsylvania, demographic challenges as their population shrinks, about how we can make sure Pennsylvania grows and prospers, whether you're in southeastern Pennsylvania or western Pennsylvania or anywhere in between. So I think there's a moment in time where we can do that. And I think that moment really begins by the Senate Republicans sending the budget over to the governor.
We've been speaking with Representative Matt Bradford, House Majority Leader. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.